The rain didn't care that Vivienne Alcott had just lost everything. It came down in sheets against the windshield of her Bentley, the last thing she still owned outright, the one thing the bankruptcy receivers hadn't yet cataloged and tagged, and had hammered the roof like it was trying to break through to her. She sat on the shoulder of Route 9, somewhere between the city she'd built her empire in and the town she'd grown up desperate to escape. And she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and made a sound she didn't recognize, low, animal, the kind of sound a person makes when the last wall comes down. Her phone had 17 missed calls from her CFO, 4 from her attorney and one single one, from her daughter, who was 12 years old and had seen her mother's face on the news that afternoon, under a chyron that read, Alcott Industries in freefall, CEO faces fraud inquiry. The car had died 20 minutes ago. The engine, without warning, without drama, had simply stopped, as if it too had decided it was finished. Outside, the storm was total, the kind of dark that swallows road signs. This is the moment the world she'd built cracked open, and something she never could have planned for stepped through. 3 weeks earlier, Vivienne had been on the cover of a magazine. The photograph showed her standing in the atrium of Alcott Tower, 54th floor, the skyline of New York spread behind her like a trophy. The headline read, "The Woman Who Doesn't Lose." She had laughed at that headline when she first saw it, in the quiet way of someone who knows better than to trust good press. She'd built Alcott Industries from a 2-room, midtown office over 14 years, supply chain technology, logistics infrastructure, the unglamorous architecture of how the world moves goods from one place to another, not glamorous. Deeply profitable, 300 employees, a board seat at 2 nonprofits, a daughter she was trying very hard not to fail. Then Ryan Garrett happened. Ryan had been her COO for 6 years, her closest professional confidant. And for 11 months she would never fully forgive herself for something more complicated than that. He had been methodical in a way she had mistaken for loyalty, patient in a way she had mistaken for steadiness. What he had actually been doing, during those 6 years and those 11 months, was positioning, moving money through subsidiary accounts in increments small enough to evade automated flags, attributing the losses to a market downturn she genuinely believed was real. When the auditors found it, they found $7 million, and her signature on documents she did not remember signing. Documents that bore her signature, because Ryan had learned to replicate it perfectly. The forensic accountant explained this carefully, as if careful explanation could soften the weight of it. The board froze her operating authority within 48 hours. Her attorney advised no public statements. Her publicist, in a decade of loyalty, sent a brief, regretful email explaining that continuing their relationship would present a conflict of interest. She had sat in her corner office that last evening, watching the cleaning crew move through the empty bullpen with their cart and their quiet efficiency, and she'd thought, they don't know yet. Tomorrow they will. She turned off her own lights when she left. She took nothing but her coat. The worst part was not the headlines. It was not the frozen accounts or the board's cold parliamentary efficiency in stripping her authority. The worst part was understanding that the person who had done this to her had also, at one point, known her well enough to know exactly how much it would cost. The gas station was 3/4 of a mile from where the Bentley died. She walked it in the rain without an umbrella, her heels destroying themselves on the wet gravel, her blazer soaked through in under a minute. The fluorescent light of the station's overhang was the most welcome thing she'd seen in weeks. The attached diner was the kind that had probably looked exactly the same for 40 years. A counter with 8 stools, 4 booths with cracked vinyl, a coffee machine that looked older than she was. Nearly 11 at night, 1 waitress, 1 other customer. He was in the last booth facing the door, reading a paperback with the spine broken open the way people do when they've stopped caring about keeping things intact, coffee black. He hadn't looked up when she came in. Vivienne sat at the counter, asked for coffee, and told herself she was not going to cry in a gas station diner on a Wednesday night in the middle of a rainstorm. She was almost succeeding when she knocked the coffee off the counter. The mug shattered. The waitress made a small sound of dismay, and before Vivienne had fully processed what happened, the man from the last booth was beside her, crouching, picking up the larger pieces of ceramic, already asking if she'd burned herself. "I'm fine," she said, the least true thing she had said all month. He looked up from where he was crouching and she got her first real look at him. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that looked built to withstand pressure. Gray Henley pushed to the elbows, worn jeans. His forearms, as he held the broken pieces of her mug, were the kind that made her breath do something involuntary and inconvenient. She noticed his hands, broad, unhurried, right, and then the quality of his stillness. It was not passive stillness. It was the stillness of someone who had learned it as a discipline. Something moved through her that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Warm, visceral, and completely out of place given everything else currently on fire in her life. "You're soaked," he said. Observation, not judgment. "My car died," she said. "On the highway." He nodded, as if this was information he could work with, and went to get paper towels. She watched him move through the small space without watching him, the way you do when you don't want to be caught. He sat back in his booth and she, without fully deciding to, slid into the seat across from him. The waitress brought a new coffee without being asked. Rain pressed against the window beside them. They talked the way strangers do when it's late and the weather has stripped away the usual performance. She didn't tell him who she was. He didn't ask. He said he'd been driving for 3 weeks without a specific destination. She understood that in a way she couldn't have explained 48 hours earlier. "Running from something," she said, "or towards something." "Both," he said. "Neither." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "When was the last time you let yourself not know what came next?" It wasn't a remarkable question. It was the way he asked it, without agenda, with a directness that felt almost like trespass. That made something in her chest seize. "I don't know," she admitted, and it was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in months. His eyes came back to her face and didn't move away. The charged thing between them was entirely separate from the conversation and entirely inseparable from it. He reached across the table to push her forgotten coffee closer, and his hand brushed hers and neither of them pulled back. "I'm Vivienne," she said. "Daniel," he said. Outside, lightning printed itself across the sky. Thunder followed close enough to feel. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand slowly and held hers, and looked at her with an expression that wasn't surprise. It was something quieter. Something that looked almost like recognition. Then he was leaning across the narrow table and she was meeting him. And the kiss landed like a decision, not a question. Urgent and warm, his hand coming up to frame her jaw, her breath going sharp, tasting coffee and the particular heat underneath it. It lasted long enough to matter. When they broke apart, the waitress was very focused on the counter, and Vivienne's heart was doing something it hadn't done in years. She thought, "I don't know this man, and I am already in serious trouble." He walked back out into the rain with her and fixed the car, or diagnosed it, rather with a flashlight, from the lost and found and the unhurried. Confidence of someone who understood how things actually worked. Beneath the surface, failed fuel pump, tow in the morning. "What do you do?" she asked, leaning against the hood while he closed it. "Less," he said. By choice. She remembered how he'd spoken earlier. The specific language when she'd mentioned her industry, without naming her company. The casual, detailed fluency with logistics systems and supply infrastructure. It had registered somewhere and she'd filed it away. "You know the Alcott supply model," she said. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. Rain moved through the beam of the flashlight. "I built something similar," he said. "About 12 years ago, sold it." "What was it called?" He said the name and she stood in the rain and felt the ground shift. Meridian Logistical Group, she knew that name. Everyone in her industry knew that name. It had sold for a number that briefly restructured how venture capital thought about infrastructure technology. "You're Daniel Voss," she said. "I was," he said without pride or apology. "I sold after my wife died. She was the reason I built it. I didn't want to run it without her." A pause. "I've been trying to figure out what I am without it." She understood then why he'd been driving without a destination. She understood it in a way she hadn't understood anything in a long time. Because she was doing the same thing, just without a car that worked. He arranged the tow. Drove her to a motel 40 minutes away. Separate rooms, nothing discussed. In the morning they had breakfast, at a place that made better eggs than anything she'd had in years, and she realized she'd gone 8 hours without checking her phone. which was the longest stretch in 3 weeks. Over the next 2 weeks, they kept finding reasons to extend what should have been one night's accident. She had nowhere urgent to be. He had nowhere he'd committed to. Then her attorney called with something new. A potential investor had contacted the firm quietly, someone who believed the fraud case was prosecutable, her role entirely exculpatory, and who was willing to provide bridge capital to keep Alcott Industries solvent through the legal process, structured to return her full operational control upon resolution. She accepted on the merits. The terms were clean, fair, and intelligent. She found out it was Daniel 4 days later. She called him from the parking lot of her attorney's office, and when he answered, she didn't bother with a preamble.
"Why didn't you tell me?"
"Because I wanted you to evaluate it without knowing," he said. "And you did. You bought into my company. I bought into a fundamentally sound system run by someone who didn't steal from it. That's not sentiment, that's investment logic." A pause, quieter. "But I'd be lying if I said the other thing had nothing to do with it." She sat with that for a long moment. The problem was that she believed him, both parts. And believing both parts simultaneously was somehow more complicated than if she'd believed neither. She drove to his address. He opened the door before she knocked. She didn't give him time to speak. 2 steps and she pulled him down to her, and the kiss was different from the first. Less surprise. More weight, more consequence. His arms came around her completely. Her back found the door frame. It was briefer than the first, and it hit harder, because this time they both knew exactly what they were deciding. When she pulled back, she kept her hands on his chest and looked at him. "This is complicated," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I need you to not make decisions about my company without telling me." "Yes," he said again. "I know." She believed that too. That was the problem, or possibly the answer. The photograph ran on a Thursday, taken at distance, slightly blurred. The two of them leaving a restaurant, published under the headline, "Alcott Crisis or Calculated Comeback, Mysterious Backer Seen with Embattled CEO." Her communications director called it a problem. Her attorney called it manageable. Her daughter, who was 12 and found the blog post herself, called quietly and asked, "Mom, who is he?" That question did more damage than the headline. Vivienne spent the following days sitting with a specific fear she couldn't quite articulate to anyone. Not even Daniel. It wasn't about optics or governance conflicts. It was the fear that she was incapable of trusting her own judgment about people anymore. Ryan Garrett had been proof of that. What if the warmth she felt toward Daniel was simply the same mechanism reskinned? What if she was drawn to him not despite the power he held over her circumstances, but because of it? She told him she needed space. He said, "I know. No argument, no push. Just I'll be here when you've thought it through." That answer scared her more than pressure would have. She avoided him for 11 days. She worked. She met with her legal team, her remaining board members, the institutional partners who were still in. She had dinner with her daughter twice, and her daughter didn't mention the photograph again, which was its own kind of grace. On the 12th day, the DA's office confirmed the hard drive had been recovered. The fraud trail led directly and exclusively to Ryan Garrett. Charges were being filed. Vivienne Alcott was not a target of the investigation. She sat alone in her office at 10 that night. The city spread below her, the same view she'd turned away from in the dark weeks ago, and understood that the loneliness she felt now had a specific shape, and that shape had a name. She called him. "Where are you?" she said. "Parking garage under your building." A beat. "I was in the neighborhood." She laughed, truly laughed the first time in weeks, and said, "Come up." When he walked through her door, she was already moving, and he met her in the middle of the room. This kiss was slow. No urgency, no decision-making urgency, just his hands framing her face, her fingers at his collar, both of them shaking slightly, with the effort of being careful with something that mattered too much. She felt her own heartbeat in her throat. She felt him exhale against her mouth like a man who had been holding something for 11 days and was finally allowed to set it down. They sat on the floor of her office with the city below them, both quiet for a while. "I almost convinced myself it wasn't real," she said, "that I'd manufactured it because I needed something solid to hold."
"Did you convince yourself?"
"No," she said. "That was the problem. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I was terrified the whole 11 days that you'd decide the math didn't work. That the conflict of interest was too clean an excuse to walk. It was a good excuse, she said. I know, that's why it scared me. She looked at him. What are you actually afraid of? Not the practical things. He thought about it the way he always thought about things. Seriously, without performance. That I'll love someone this much again, he said, and not get enough time. She took his hand. He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. I'm not a rebound, she said. I need you to know that. You're not a project, he said. I need you to know that. She did know. She had known it in the way he'd structured the investment. Clean, fair, her authority protected at every clause. She'd known it in the 11 days he'd waited without pressing. She'd known it in the parking garage I was in the neighborhood. She leaned toward him. He closed the rest of the distance. And this kiss was nothing like the ones before it. No urgency, no electricity. Just his hands gentle on her face, her hands over his, barely moving. The kind of kiss that isn't about hunger. The kind that means I am not going anywhere. The city light moved across them. The building held its silence. Something in her chest that had been braced for a very long time finally, carefully released. The board asked for full disclosure. She gave it, calmly in writing with her attorney present. Daniel moved his stake to a passive position without being asked, eliminating the governance conflict. He issued a one-paragraph statement through his attorney that was purely financial in language and contained nothing personal. 3 board members resigned anyway. 1 institutional partner withdrew. The company ran leaner for 2 quarters. So did she in certain rooms. Among certain people who had decided what the photograph meant and weren't interested in revision. But she kept her name on the building. She earned that back quarter by quarter, decision by decision, not because of Daniel's capital, though it had bought her time, but because the system she'd built was sound, because the fraud case resolved publicly and completely in her favor, and because it turned out that 300 people who'd believed in her enough to stay through the worst of it could build significant momentum. On a Thursday evening in early spring, she drove back out on Route Mile 9. She knew why she was going, before she admitted it to herself. When she pulled into the gas station, Daniel's car was already in the lot. She'd told him where she was going, and he knew her well enough to understand what it meant. She walked into the diner. Same fluorescent light, same cracked vinyl, same coffee machine. He was in the last booth, reading something, same broken spine habit. He looked up when the bell above the door rang. She slid into the seat across from him. He studied her face the way he always did, quietly, completely, without needing to comment on what he found there. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about the cover of that magazine, the empty office, the rain that hadn't cared, the sound she'd made alone in the car. She thought about a broken coffee mug and a man crouching on a diner floor, picking up the pieces without being asked, like someone who knows what comes next, she said, and isn't afraid of it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Outside, the evening settled into the trees along the highway. The coffee came without asking. She had spent 14 years building something she thought was permanent and watched it crack open in a single week. What she hadn't understood until now was that some things only show you what they're made of after they've broken. She was one of them. So was this, and for the first time in years she was exactly where she had meant to be.